Sarah Johnson lacks the initiative and client management skills necessary for account leadership. Her contributions remain purely administrative in nature. The words from my annual performance review felt like a slap across the face as I sat, alone in the cramped break room of Miller & Associates Marketing, tucked away in a converted warehouse building in Portland's industrial district. 2 years of 70-hour weeks, of building digital campaigns that won regional awards, of transforming struggling businesses into industry success stories, all reduced to administrative contributions by a supervisor who hadn't worked a single weekend in the 3 years I'd known him. My hands trembled slightly as I reread the devastating assessment, each word carefully crafted to diminish everything I'd accomplished. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows across the document that would supposedly determine my future at the company. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of my colleagues wrapping up their 8-hour days while I prepared for another evening of unpaid overtime, another night of building someone else's reputation while my own contributions were systematically erased. I'm Sarah Johnson, 27 years old, and until this moment I'd believed that hard work and talent would eventually be recognized and rewarded. I'd graduated summa cum laude from the University of Oregon with a degree in digital marketing, spent my college years interning at agencies across the Pacific Northwest, and joined Miller & Associates with dreams of building innovative campaigns that would revolutionize how businesses connected with their audiences. Instead, I found myself trapped in a system designed to exploit my dedication while denying me any meaningful recognition or advancement. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was reading this evaluation while secretly managing the relationship with Cascade Technologies, our agency's most valuable client, worth $2.3 million annually. A client whose executives believed they were working directly with senior leadership, completely unaware that their entire digital transformation strategy was being conceived, developed, and executed by someone my employer considered merely administrative support. The journey that led me to this moment began 2 years earlier, when I walked through the glass doors of Miller & Associates with genuine excitement about my first real marketing position. The agency occupied the top 2 floors of a renovated brick building in Portland's Pearl District, with exposed beams and industrial fixtures that gave it the trendy startup atmosphere I'd imagined for my career. David Miller, the founder and owner, had impressed me during the interview process with his talk of innovation, collaboration, and creating a new generation of marketing professionals who understood the digital landscape. "We're not like those stuffy traditional agencies," he'd said, leaning back in his leather chair while gesturing toward the open workspace where young professionals huddled around standing desks and MacBooks. "Here, good ideas can come from anyone, and we believe in promoting talent based on merit, not politics or seniority." I'd been fresh out of college, eager to prove myself, and convinced that I'd found the perfect place to launch my career. The starting salary wasn't spectacular, but David had hinted at rapid advancement opportunities for exceptional performers, and I was confident that my work would speak for itself. What I didn't understand then was how naive I was about the difference between what employers promise and what they actually deliver. My first assignment was supporting the account team for Cascade Technologies, a mid-sized software company that had hired Miller & Associates to overhaul their digital presence. Their previous marketing efforts had been traditional and ineffective, resulting in stagnant growth and diminishing market share in an increasingly competitive industry. They needed a complete digital transformation, from social media strategy to content marketing to search engine optimization. The account was being managed by Jennifer Walsh, a senior strategist who'd been with the agency for 5 years. Jennifer was everything I aspired to become: confident, knowledgeable, and respected by both clients and colleagues. She took me under her wing during those early weeks, teaching me the intricacies of client management while allowing me to contribute meaningfully to campaign development. The key to success in this business, Jennifer told me during one of our late-night strategy sessions, is understanding that marketing isn't about clever slogans or flashy graphics. It's about building genuine relationships between businesses and their customers. Everything we do should serve that fundamental purpose. Under Jennifer's mentorship, I discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of digital marketing that went beyond what I'd learned in textbooks. I could analyze social media trends and predict which content would resonate with specific audiences. I understood the subtle psychology behind successful email campaigns and the technical aspects of search engine optimization that many marketers found intimidating. Most importantly, I could translate complex digital strategies into clear, actionable plans that clients could understand and embrace. The Cascade Technologies account became my proving ground. I spent countless hours researching their industry, analyzing their competitors, and developing innovative approaches to positioning their software solutions in a crowded marketplace. I created detailed buyer personas based on extensive market research, developed content calendars that aligned with industry events and seasonal trends, and designed social media campaigns that engaged their target audience in meaningful conversations about technology and innovation. The results were remarkable. Within 6 months, Cascade's social media engagement increased by 240%. Their website traffic tripled, with significantly improved conversion rates from visitors to qualified leads. Most importantly, their revenue grew by 35% in the first year of our partnership, directly attributable to the digital marketing initiatives we'd implemented. Jennifer was generous in sharing credit for these successes, always emphasizing my contributions. During team meetings and client presentations, she made sure I was included in strategy discussions and encouraged me to present my ideas directly to Cascade's leadership team. For the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was making a real difference while building the kind of career I'd always imagined. Then Jennifer left the agency. She'd grown frustrated with David Miller's management style and his tendency to prioritize profit margins over employee development. Despite the success she'd achieved with multiple accounts, she felt undervalued and saw limited opportunities for advancement within the company's existing structure. Her departure was sudden, announced on a Friday afternoon with an effective date the following Monday. "Sarah, you're ready for more responsibility than David will ever give you here," she told me during our goodbye lunch at a small cafe near the office. "You have the talent and the drive to be running your own accounts, but this place will keep you in a support role as long as you let them. Don't make the mistake of thinking loyalty will be rewarded. In this business, you have to advocate for yourself because no one else will." Her words proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined at the time. With Jennifer's departure, David Miller made a decision that would define the next 2 years of my professional life. Instead of promoting me to manage the Cascade account, despite my intimate knowledge of their business and proven track record of success, he assigned the account to himself while designating me as project coordinator. In practice, this meant I would continue doing all the actual work while he took credit for the results and maintained direct client relationships. "Sarah, I know you were hoping for more responsibility," David explained during a brief meeting in his corner office. "But Cascade is too important to risk on someone without senior-level experience. You'll continue supporting the account, and I'll handle all strategic decisions and client communications." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Think of this as an extended learning opportunity. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, but I was too shocked to respond effectively. I'd assumed that my proven results with Cascade would naturally lead to account ownership, or at least a significant promotion with increased responsibility and compensation. Instead, I was being relegated to an invisible support role while someone else claimed ownership of my work. What made the situation even more frustrating was David's approach to managing the account. He would review my campaign strategies and creative concepts then present them to Cascade's team as collaborative efforts where my role was carefully minimized. He'd take my detailed research and analysis, reformat it with his letterhead, and deliver presentations that made it appear as though the insights were his own. Sarah provided some helpful background research, became his standard way of acknowledging my contributions if he acknowledged them at all. Meanwhile, he was billing Cascade for senior-level strategic consulting while paying me an entry-level salary and expecting me to work whatever hours were necessary to deliver exceptional results. The workload was relentless. Cascade Technologies was growing rapidly, which meant their marketing needs were constantly evolving and expanding. They wanted more sophisticated social media campaigns, more targeted advertising strategies, more comprehensive content marketing programs. Each new initiative required extensive research, careful planning, and meticulous execution. I was essentially running a full-service marketing department for $1 million client while being compensated as an administrative assistant. My typical workday began at 7 in the morning and rarely ended before 8 in the evening. Weekends became extensions of the work week as I developed campaigns, analyzed performance metrics, and prepared presentations for Monday morning meetings I wouldn't be invited to attend. I was averaging over 60 hours per week, with at least 20 of those hours completely unpaid, justified by David as professional development and investment in my future career advancement. The physical and emotional toll was significant. I was constantly exhausted, surviving on coffee and determination while watching my peers at other agencies advance in their careers and enjoy normal work-life balance. I missed family gatherings, social events, and opportunities to build relationships outside of work because I was always either at the office or working from home on Cascade projects. But what kept me motivated, even during the most difficult periods, was the direct impact I could see my work having on Cascade's success. Their business was thriving, their brand recognition was growing, and their leadership team was consistently impressed with the innovative marketing strategies they believed were coming from David's strategic vision. I took pride in knowing that my efforts were driving real results, even if I wasn't receiving appropriate credit or compensation. The breaking point came 18 months into this arrangement, when David made a decision that revealed just how little he valued my contributions. His nephew, Brad Miller, had recently graduated from college with a general business degree and no specific marketing experience. Rather than starting Brad in an entry-level position where he could learn the fundamentals of the industry, David hired him directly as a senior digital strategist, with a starting salary that exceeded what I was earning after 2 years of exceptional performance. Brad brings fresh perspective and family commitment to the agency, David announced during a staff meeting where he introduced his nephew to the team. He'll be working closely with our major accounts to develop next-generation marketing strategies. The nepotism was blatant and offensive, but what made it truly insulting was Brad's immediate assignment to the Cascade account. David positioned him as the creative visionary behind campaigns I had conceptualized, developed, and executed. Brad would attend client meetings where he'd present my strategies as his own innovations, while I remained in the background providing what David termed technical support. Brad's lack of experience was obvious to anyone with basic marketing knowledge, but David carefully managed client interactions to minimize Brad's exposure to detailed questions or complex strategic discussions. I would brief Brad before every meeting, explaining the rationale behind each campaign element and coaching him on potential client concerns. Then I would watch from the sidelines as he took credit for work that represented months of my creative effort and professional expertise. The situation became even more absurd when Cascade's executives began requesting specific modifications to campaigns or asking detailed questions about performance metrics. Brad would nod confidently during these discussions, then immediately bring the questions back to me for actual answers. I became a ghost strategist, invisible to the client but responsible for every aspect of their marketing success. Despite the frustration and exploitation, I continued delivering exceptional results because my professional pride wouldn't allow me to compromise the quality of my work. Cascade's digital marketing performance continued improving under my invisible guidance. Their social media following grew to over 50,000 engaged followers. Their content marketing program generated hundreds of qualified leads each month. Their search engine optimization efforts resulted in first-page rankings for dozens of competitive industry keywords. Each success was publicly attributed to David's leadership and Brad's innovative thinking, while my contributions remained carefully hidden from client view. The psychological impact of this systematic erasure was profound. I began questioning my own professional abilities and wondering if I was delusional about the quality of my work. Maybe David was right about my lack of senior-level capabilities. Maybe I really was just administrative support masquerading as a strategic thinker. These doubts were reinforced by David's regular comments about my performance and potential. "Sarah, you're doing solid work, but you need to think more strategically if you want to advance," he'd say after presentations where I'd developed every strategic element he was discussing. "Focus on developing your leadership skills and client relationship abilities." The gaslighting was subtle but persistent, designed to keep me grateful for the opportunity to work on prestigious accounts while accepting substandard compensation and recognition. David had created a system where I was essential to the agency's most important client relationship, but powerless to advocate for appropriate treatment or advancement. What David didn't understand, however, was that his strategy of keeping me invisible to protect his own position was actually creating the foundation for his eventual downfall. By preventing me from having direct contact with Cascade's leadership team, he was inadvertently motivating me to find alternative ways to demonstrate my value and build professional relationships. I began documenting everything, every campaign I developed, every strategy session I led, every innovative solution I created for Cascade's marketing challenges. I saved emails, client feedback, performance reports, and creative materials that told the complete story of who was actually driving their marketing success. I wasn't planning any specific action at the time, but some instinct told me that evidence of my contributions might eventually become important. I also started paying closer attention to how other agencies operated and what opportunities might exist outside of Miller & Associates. I attended industry networking events, participated in online marketing forums, and gradually built relationships with other professionals who could provide perspective on my situation and potential career alternatives. Most importantly, I began educating myself about the business aspects of marketing consulting that I'd never needed to understand as an employee. I researched business licensing requirements, professional insurance options, client contract structures, and pricing strategies for independent consultants. I wasn't actively planning to leave the agency, but I was preparing myself for whatever opportunities might emerge. The final catalyst for change came when David announced his intention to pitch Cascade Technologies on a comprehensive rebranding project worth $500,000. The proposal would require extensive strategic analysis, competitive research, brand positioning development, and creative execution across multiple marketing channels. It was exactly the kind of high-level project I'd been hoping to lead as a natural progression in my career. Instead, David assigned me to develop the entire proposal while positioning Brad as the project leader who would present our recommendations and manage client relationships throughout the rebranding process. I would remain invisible, providing what David called research support and project coordination, while Brad received credit for strategic thinking and creative direction. "This is a great opportunity for Brad to demonstrate his strategic capabilities," David explained during a planning meeting. "Sarah, your job is to make sure he has all the background information and creative materials he needs to deliver an outstanding presentation." As I listened to David outline his expectations, I realized that nothing would ever change unless I took control of my own career trajectory. I could continue enabling this exploitative system indefinitely, watching my professional achievements be attributed to others while accepting minimal compensation and recognition. Or I could finally act on the knowledge and relationships I'd been quietly building over the past 2 years. That night, I made a decision that would transform my professional life and expose the true nature of the client relationships David thought he controlled. The rain was pattering against the windows of my small apartment in southeast Portland as I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, staring at an email that would change everything. It was from Jennifer Chen, the Chief Marketing Officer at Cascade Technologies, and it had arrived completely outside of the official communication channels that David Miller insisted on controlling. "Hi, Sarah," the message began. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I got your email address from the signature on one of the campaign reports you sent last month. I wanted to discuss some ideas for our Q4 digital strategy, and I was hoping we could set up a brief call this week." My heart raced as I read those words. Jennifer Chen was reaching out to me personally, bypassing David and Brad entirely. This wasn't supposed to happen according to the carefully constructed hierarchy that kept me invisible to our most important client. Yet here was proof that my work had made enough of an impression that Cascade's leadership wanted to engage with me directly. I had met Jennifer briefly during a few client presentations, always introduced as Sarah from our project team, without any specific title or role description. During those meetings, I'd noticed her asking detailed questions about campaign performance, metrics and strategic rationale that Brad couldn't answer, and David would deflect with vague promises to follow up with more detailed analysis. I'd been the one providing that analysis, writing comprehensive reports that David would forward under his own name. What I hadn't realized was that Jennifer had been paying attention to the quality and depth of those reports. She'd noticed that the strategic insights were consistently sophisticated and well-researched, far beyond what she was seeing in the superficial presentations that Brad delivered. She'd begun wondering who was actually behind the impressive work that was driving Cascade's marketing success. The email had arrived on a Tuesday evening while I was working late on the rebranding proposal that David expected me to develop for Brad to present. I'd been putting in 12-hour days for the past 2 weeks, researching Cascade's competitive landscape, analyzing industry trends, and developing creative concepts that would position their software solutions for maximum market impact. The work was complex and demanding, requiring the kind of strategic thinking that David claimed I lacked. I stared at Jennifer's email for several minutes, uncertain how to respond. David had made it clear that all client communication should flow through official channels, meaning him or Brad. Direct contact between junior staff and major clients was explicitly prohibited, supposedly to maintain consistent messaging and prevent confusion about account management responsibilities. In reality, it was designed to ensure that David controlled all client relationships and could take credit for work he hadn't contributed to. But this wasn't a case of me inappropriately reaching out to a client. Jennifer Chen had initiated contact, specifically requesting my input on strategic matters. She clearly valued my perspective and wanted to engage with the person she'd identified as the real source of the marketing insights that had been driving Cascade's success. Ignoring her request would be professionally irresponsible and potentially damaging to the client relationship that David claimed to prioritize above everything else. I decided to respond carefully, acknowledging her request while being transparent about the agency's communication protocols. "Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss Q4 strategy ideas with you. I should mention that our usual protocol involves coordinating client communications through David Miller, but I'm certainly available to provide whatever insights would be most helpful for your planning process." Her response came within hours, and it revealed much more about her perspective on our working relationship than I'd expected. "Sarah, I appreciate you mentioning the protocol, but honestly, I've been hoping to connect directly with whoever has been developing the strategic analysis in your reports. The quality of thinking and depth of market understanding has been exceptional, and I'd prefer to work with that person directly rather than going through multiple layers of management." The implication was clear. Jennifer Chen, the decision-maker, for our most valuable client account, had identified me as the source of the strategic value that Miller and Associates was providing. She wasn't interested in working through David or Brad because she recognized that they were merely intermediaries passing along work they hadn't contributed to. She wanted to collaborate with the actual strategist, regardless of what organizational hierarchy David had constructed to protect his position. This realization was both thrilling and terrifying. On one hand, it validated everything I'd suspected about the quality of my work and its impact on Cascade's business success. A senior executive at a major technology company was specifically seeking my strategic input, recognizing value that my own employer refused to acknowledge. On the other hand, it put me in a position where I would need to navigate carefully between serving the client's needs and respecting the employment relationship that, however unfair, still determined my livelihood. I scheduled a call with Jennifer for the following Friday afternoon, timing it for after normal business hours when I could speak freely without worrying about David or Brad overhearing. I spent the rest of the week preparing for what I knew would be a pivotal conversation, one that could either strengthen the client relationship or create significant complications with my employer. During our call, Jennifer's questions revealed just how closely she'd been following the strategic work I'd been producing. She asked about specific market research methodologies I'd used to identify emerging trends in the software industry. She wanted to understand the analytical framework I'd applied to evaluate their competitive positioning. Most importantly, she was interested in my recommendations for expanding Cascade's digital presence into new market segments that she'd been considering for future growth. "Sarah, the strategic thinking in your reports has been consistently sophisticated and actionable," she told me during that first conversation. "I've been in technology marketing for 15 years, and I can recognize quality analysis when I see it. I'm hoping we can work together more directly on some initiatives I've been planning." The conversation lasted over an hour, covering everything from content marketing strategies to social media optimization to lead generation techniques. Jennifer treated me as a senior strategist, asking for my professional opinion on complex marketing challenges and listening carefully to my recommendations. It was the kind of client interaction I'd been hoping to have for 2 years, finally being recognized for the expertise I'd been developing while remaining invisible within my own agency. By the end of the call, Jennifer had outlined several projects she wanted to discuss further, including a comprehensive analysis of emerging markets for Cascade's software solutions and a strategic plan for launching their products in international markets. These were exactly the kinds of high-level assignments that David claimed I wasn't ready to handle. Yet here was the client specifically requesting my involvement in strategic planning that would determine their company's future direction. "I'd like to set up regular strategy sessions where we can discuss these initiatives in detail," Jennifer said as our conversation concluded. "Would weekly calls work for your schedule? I know you're probably managing multiple accounts, but I'd really value having consistent access to your strategic perspective." I agreed to the weekly calls, knowing that I was crossing into territory that David would consider completely inappropriate if he knew about it. But I also recognized that this was an opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities in ways that had been systematically prevented within the agency structure. If I could prove my value to Cascade's leadership team, it might eventually lead to the recognition and advancement that had been denied to me for so long. What I didn't anticipate was how much these conversations would change my understanding of my own professional capabilities and career potential. Over the following months, my weekly calls with Jennifer became strategic planning sessions where I was providing high-level consulting on marketing initiatives worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She would bring complex business challenges to our conversations, and I would develop comprehensive solutions that integrated market research, competitive analysis, and creative strategy. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways that my daily responsibilities at Miller & Associates had never been. Instead of executing campaigns that others had conceptualized, I was developing original strategic frameworks that addressed Cascade's specific business objectives. Instead of providing background research for someone else's presentations, I was directly advising a senior executive on decisions that would impact her company's growth trajectory. Jennifer's feedback was consistently positive and encouraging. "Sarah, your ability to synthesize complex market data into actionable strategic recommendations is impressive," she told me after I'd presented an analysis of emerging trends in the software industry. "You're thinking about these challenges at a level that I usually only see from senior consultants with decades of experience." These conversations were happening completely outside of David's awareness, during evening hours when I was supposedly working on the administrative tasks he'd assigned to me. I was essentially running a parallel consulting relationship with our most important client, providing strategic services that went far beyond anything Miller & Associates was formally contracted to deliver. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was doing my best work during unpaid overtime hours, developing strategies that would drive millions of dollars in revenue for both Cascade Technologies and, indirectly, for Miller & Associates. David was billing premium rates for strategic consulting services while remaining completely unaware that the actual consulting was being provided by someone he considered merely administrative support. Meanwhile, my visible responsibilities at the agency continued to be frustrating and demoralizing. Brad Miller's incompetence was becoming increasingly obvious as he struggled to understand even basic marketing concepts. Yet David continued promoting him as a strategic visionary who was driving Cascade's success. During client presentations, Brad would confidently discuss campaign strategies he couldn't explain in detail, relying on talking points I'd prepared for him without understanding the underlying strategic rationale. The disconnect between my official role and my actual impact became even more pronounced when Jennifer began implementing strategies we'd discussed during our private conversations. Cascade would request specific campaign modifications or new initiative development that aligned perfectly with recommendations I'd made, but David and Brad interpreted these requests as validation of their own strategic thinking. "Jennifer Chen is really responding to our thought leadership," David would say during team meetings after Cascade had requested implementation of an idea I'd suggested during one of our calls. "Brad's strategic vision is really resonating with their executive team." I would sit quietly during these meetings, listening to David and Brad take credit for innovations that had emerged from my direct consulting relationship with the client. The psychological toll of this systematic erasure was significant, but it was balanced by the knowledge that I was building something valuable that existed independent of their recognition or approval. As months passed, my relationship with Jennifer evolved beyond professional collaboration into something resembling mentorship. She began sharing insights about the business challenges facing technology companies, the strategic thinking required for executive-level decision-making, and the career path that had led her to become a chief marketing officer at a major software company. "Sarah, you have the analytical skills and strategic thinking ability to be running your own accounts," she told me during one of our conversations. "Have you considered what it would take to advance into senior-level positions, either at your current agency or elsewhere?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding for months. Despite the valuable experience I was gaining through my work with Jennifer, my official position at Miller & Associates remained unchanged. David showed no signs of recognizing my contributions or providing opportunities for advancement. If anything, his commitment to keeping me in a support role seemed to be strengthening as Brad's limitations became more apparent, and my behind-the-scenes contributions became more essential to maintaining client satisfaction. I began researching what it would take to transition into independent consulting, studying business models that would allow me to provide strategic marketing services directly to companies like Cascade Technologies. The more I learned about the consulting industry, the more I realized that I was already providing many of the services that independent consultants charged premium rates for, but I was doing it as unpaid overtime while someone else collected the revenue and recognition. Jennifer noticed my interest in consulting and offered to share her perspective on working with external marketing advisors. "The best consultants I've worked with understand that their success depends on delivering measurable results for their clients," she explained. "They're strategic partners who take ownership of outcomes rather than just completing assigned tasks." This conversation crystallized something I'd been sensing but hadn't articulated clearly. My relationship with Jennifer had evolved into exactly the kind of strategic partnership that successful consultants build with their clients. I was taking ownership of Cascade's marketing outcomes, providing innovative solutions to complex challenges, and delivering measurable results that contributed directly to their business success. The only difference was that I was doing it through an employment structure that prevented me from being appropriately compensated or recognized for the value I was creating. Around this time, I also began documenting my contributions more systematically, not just for personal validation, but as a potential foundation for future career opportunities. I saved detailed records of every strategy session with Jennifer, every campaign I'd developed, every innovative solution I'd created for Cascade's marketing challenges. I tracked performance metrics that demonstrated the impact of my work on their business results, creating a comprehensive portfolio that told the story of my strategic contributions. What emerged from this documentation process was evidence of substantial business impact that went far beyond what my official job description encompassed. I had developed marketing strategies that generated millions of dollars in revenue for Cascade Technologies. I had created innovative campaigns that positioned them as thought leaders in their industry. I had built systems and processes that streamlined their marketing operations and improved their competitive positioning. Most importantly, I had established a direct consulting relationship with their executive team that was driving strategic decision-making at the highest levels of their organization. Jennifer had begun involving me in discussions about major business initiatives, seeking my input on decisions that would determine Cascade's direction for years to come. I was functioning as a senior strategic advisor while being compensated as an entry-level employee. The contrast between my actual contributions and my official recognition became even more stark when Miller & Associates received an industry award for excellence in digital marketing strategy, based entirely on the Cascade Technologies account. David and Brad attended the awards ceremony, accepting recognition for innovative campaign development and strategic thinking that had transformed a client's market position. I watched the ceremony online from my apartment, seeing David deliver an acceptance speech where he thanked his talented team for their contributions while specifically highlighting Brad's creative vision and strategic leadership. My name wasn't mentioned, despite the fact that I had personally developed every campaign and strategy that had earned the award. The disconnect between reality and recognition was so profound that it would have been laughable if it weren't so professionally damaging. I had created the work that earned the industry recognition, but I was completely invisible in the celebration of that achievement. Meanwhile, Brad Miller, who couldn't explain the basic strategic principles behind the campaigns, was being celebrated as an innovative marketing strategist. That night, as I reflected on the absurdity of the situation, I realized that continuing to enable this system was not just personally unsustainable, but professionally self-destructive. I was providing tremendous value while accepting minimal recognition and compensation, essentially subsidizing David's business success while limiting my own career development. The weekly strategy calls with Jennifer had shown me what was possible when my contributions were appropriately valued and my strategic thinking was given room to flourish. I was capable of much more than the administrative tasks David assigned to me, and I had proven that capability through the results I'd delivered for Cascade Technologies. What I needed was a way to transition from invisible contributor to recognized professional, from exploited employee to valued consultant. The question was whether I had the courage to take the risks that such a transition would require, and whether the relationships I'd built could support a fundamental change in how I approached my career. The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected, triggered by David's announcement of his plan to pursue the rebranding project that would finally force me to choose between continued exploitation and professional self-advocacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across my desk as I arrived at Miller & Associates to find David pacing excitedly around the open office space, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained enthusiasm. He was clutching a printed email in his hand, waving it like a trophy as he gathered the team around the central conference table for an impromptu meeting. "Everyone, I have incredible news," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of self-congratulation that had become increasingly familiar over the past 2 years. Jennifer Chen at Cascade Technologies has requested a comprehensive brand strategy consultation. They want us to develop a complete market positioning analysis and competitive differentiation framework. This could be worth upwards of $600,000. My stomach dropped as I listened to David describe the project scope. Every element he was outlining matched perfectly with strategic initiatives that Jennifer and I had discussed during our weekly calls over the past 3 months. The market positioning analysis, the competitive differentiation framework, the comprehensive brand strategy consultation. These were all projects that had emerged from conversations where I'd provided detailed strategic recommendations for Cascade's expansion plans. What David didn't know was that Jennifer had specifically requested these services because of the strategic insights I'd been providing during our private conversations. She had been so impressed with my analysis of their competitive landscape and my recommendations for brand positioning that she wanted to formalize our consulting relationship through an official project engagement. But because she had to work through Miller and Associates to access my services, the request had been structured as a general strategic consulting project rather than a specific engagement with me. This is exactly the kind of high-level strategic work that establishes agencies as true thought leaders, David continued, his excitement building as he outlined his vision for the project. "Brad, I want you to take the lead on this initiative. It's a perfect opportunity to demonstrate your strategic capabilities with our most important client." I watched Brad's face light up with unearned confidence as he nodded eagerly, already envisioning himself presenting strategies he couldn't develop and taking credit for insights he couldn't generate. The irony was so profound, it was almost surreal. Here was a project that existed entirely because of my strategic consulting relationship with the client, being assigned to someone who lacked the fundamental knowledge to understand what Cascade Technologies actually needed. "Sarah, you'll provide research support and project coordination," David added, almost as an afterthought. "Make sure Brad has all the background information he needs to deliver an outstanding strategic analysis." The casual dismissal in his tone was familiar, but this time it carried additional weight because I knew something David didn't. Jennifer Chen wasn't expecting to work with Brad Miller on this project. She was expecting to work with me, the person who had been providing the strategic insights that had convinced her to request this consulting engagement in the first place. After the meeting dispersed, I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen, trying to process the implications of what had just happened. I could continue enabling the deception by developing the strategic analysis for Brad to present, essentially ghostwriting a consultation that was meant to formalize my direct relationship with the client. Or I could find a way to ensure that Jennifer understood who would actually be working on the project she'd requested. The ethical complexity of the situation was troubling. Jennifer had requested this consultation based on the quality of strategic thinking I'd demonstrated during our private conversations. She was expecting to work with the person who had provided those insights, not with an inexperienced substitute who would be presenting my work as his own. From a client service perspective, David's assignment of Brad to lead the project was potentially damaging to the quality of deliverables that Cascade would receive. But confronting David about the assignment would require revealing the extent of my direct relationship with Jennifer, something that would likely result in immediate termination for violating agency protocols. I was trapped between serving the client's actual needs and protecting my employment, between professional integrity and economic survival. I decided to start by documenting everything I knew about Jennifer's expectations for the project. During our weekly call that Friday, I carefully probed her understanding of how the consultation would be structured and who she expected to be working with. "Sarah, I'm really excited about this strategic consulting project," she said, confirming my suspicions about her expectations. "Based on our conversations over the past few months, I know you have exactly the kind of analytical framework and market understanding that we need for this brand positioning analysis. When can we start the strategic planning process? Her assumption was clear. She expected me to be leading the strategic analysis, not providing background research for someone else to present. This wasn't just a case of mistaken expectations about organizational structure. It was a fundamental misunderstanding about who had been providing the strategic value that had led to the project request. Jennifer, I should clarify how the project team will be structured, I said carefully, choosing my words to provide transparency without directly criticizing David's assignments. David Miller will be the primary point of contact for this engagement, and Brad Miller will be leading the strategic analysis development. I'll be supporting the research and analysis components. The silence that followed my explanation lasted long enough for me to worry that the call had been disconnected. When Jennifer finally responded, her confusion was evident in her voice. "I'm not sure I understand," she said slowly. "The strategic insights and analytical framework we've been discussing, those came from your thinking, correct? I was expecting to work directly with the person who developed those recommendations." I found myself in the impossible position of having to explain why the client couldn't work directly with the person who had been providing the strategic value they wanted to pay for. The agency structure requires that client relationships be managed through senior-level staff, I explained, hating how corporate and evasive the explanation sounded. "Sarah, let me be direct about something," Jennifer said, her tone becoming more serious. "The reason I requested this strategic consultation is because of the quality of analysis you've been providing during our conversations. Your understanding of our market dynamics and competitive challenges has been exceptional. If you're not going to be the primary strategist on this project, I need to reconsider whether this engagement makes sense for us." Her statement created exactly the kind of crisis I'd been trying to avoid. The client was essentially saying that the value proposition for the entire project depended on my direct involvement, but the agency structure made that impossible without revealing the unauthorized relationship I'd been building over the past several months. "Let me discuss the project structure with David and see if we can arrange for more direct collaboration," I said, knowing that such a conversation would be professionally dangerous but necessary to preserve the client relationship. After ending the call, I spent the weekend developing a strategy for approaching David about the project structure without revealing the full extent of my relationship with Jennifer. I would frame it as a client service issue, emphasizing that Cascade had specifically requested my involvement based on the quality of analysis I'd provided in previous projects. Monday morning, I requested a private meeting with David to discuss the Cascade consultation project. His corner office felt more intimidating than usual as I prepared to navigate a conversation that could determine both my future at the agency and the success of our most important client relationship. "David, I wanted to discuss the project structure for the Cascade strategic consultation," I began, trying to project confidence despite my nervousness. "Based on my previous work on their account, I think there might be value in having me take a more active role in the strategic analysis development." His expression shifted from mild curiosity to obvious irritation. "Sarah, we've discussed this before. You're not ready for senior-level client interaction. Brad will be handling the strategic components of this project, and you'll provide research support. That's the appropriate allocation of responsibilities based on experience levels." "I understand the general protocol," I persisted, but Jennifer Chen specifically mentioned appreciating the analytical approach in previous campaign reports. She might be expecting continuity in the strategic methodology. David's irritation deepened into something approaching anger. "Sarah, let me be clear about something. Brad is leading this project because he has the strategic thinking capabilities that this kind of consultation requires. Your role is to provide the background research and data analysis that supports his strategic development. Cascade doesn't need to know about internal project roles. They just need to receive outstanding strategic recommendations." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. But what was more troubling was his complete confidence that he understood the client's needs better than I did, despite having had minimal direct contact with Jennifer over the past several months. He was so invested in his narrative about Brad's strategic capabilities and my administrative limitations that he couldn't consider the possibility that the client might have different expectations. I'm concerned that there might be some disconnect between what the client is expecting and how we're planning to deliver this project, I said, making one final attempt to raise the issue diplomatically. Sarah, I appreciate your concern for client satisfaction, but I think I have a better understanding of what Cascade needs from this engagement, David replied dismissively. Your job is to make sure Brad has all the research and analysis he needs to deliver exceptional strategic recommendations. Focus on that responsibility and let me worry about client relationship management. The meeting ended with my concerns completely dismissed and the project structure unchanged. Brad would be presenting himself as the strategic leader for a consultation that existed only because of my direct relationship with the client, while I would be relegated to providing invisible support for strategic work that I had essentially already completed during my private conversations with Jennifer. Over the following weeks, I watched the project development process with a mixture of fascination and horror. Brad approached the strategic analysis with the confidence of someone who believed he understood Cascade's business challenges, despite having never had a substantive conversation with their leadership team about market dynamics or competitive positioning. His initial approach involved generic market research methodologies and standard competitive analysis frameworks that bore no relationship to the sophisticated strategic thinking that Jennifer was expecting. He would spend hours researching industry trends that I had already analyzed in detail, developing insights that were months behind the strategic conversations that had been driving the project request. Meanwhile, I was tasked with providing background research that actually involved developing the complete strategic framework that Brad would eventually present as his own thinking. I found myself in the absurd position of creating the analysis that would fulfill Jennifer's expectations while ensuring that Brad could present it convincingly enough to maintain the illusion that he had developed it independently. The work was intellectually demanding and emotionally exhausting. I was essentially writing a comprehensive strategic consultation that addressed complex business challenges I understood better than anyone else involved in the project, but I had to structure it in a way that would allow someone with minimal strategic understanding to present it credibly. During my weekly calls with Jennifer, I had to carefully manage her expectations about the project timeline and deliverables without revealing the internal dysfunction that was complicating the development process. She would ask detailed questions about strategic methodology and analytical approaches that I couldn't answer directly because I was supposedly only providing research support. Sarah, I'm curious about the competitive analysis framework that your team is developing, she said during one of our calls. Based on our previous discussions about market positioning, I'm hoping the analysis will address some of the differentiation challenges we've identified. I found myself in the impossible position of trying to discuss strategic work I was actually developing while pretending that someone else was responsible for the strategic thinking. The team is working on a comprehensive framework that should address those positioning challenges, I replied vaguely, hating how evasive and unhelpful the response sounded. Will you be involved in the presentation of the strategic recommendations? Jennifer asked, her question revealing her continued expectation that I would be directly engaged in the project delivery. I'll be supporting the presentation development, I said, which was technically true, but completely misleading about my actual role in creating the strategic content. As the project deadline approached, the dysfunction became more pronounced. Brad was struggling to understand the strategic analysis I'd developed well enough to present it convincingly, while David was becoming increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as Brad's lack of preparation and strategic sophistication. Brad, you need to be able to speak more confidently about the analytical methodology, David said during one of our preparation meetings. The client is going to ask detailed questions about how we developed these recommendations. I watched Brad nod uncertainly, knowing that he couldn't explain the analytical methodology because he hadn't developed it and didn't fully understand the strategic reasoning behind the recommendations. I had created a comprehensive framework based on months of direct consultation with the client about their specific business challenges, but Brad was expected to present it as though he had developed it through independent analysis. The situation reached a breaking point during a practice presentation session where Brad was supposed to walk through the strategic recommendations before the client meeting. His explanation of the competitive analysis was superficial and confused, demonstrating that he didn't understand the market dynamics that had informed the strategic framework. "Brad, this doesn't sound like the sophisticated strategic thinking that Cascade is expecting," David said, his frustration becoming visible. "Sarah, can you help clarify the analytical approach we used for the competitive positioning analysis?" I found myself explaining my own strategic methodology to the person who was supposed to have developed it, walking Brad through the reasoning behind recommendations that had emerged from my direct understanding of Cascade's business challenges. The absurdity of the situation was so extreme that it would have been comedic if the professional stakes weren't so high. "I think Brad just needs more time to internalize the strategic framework," I said diplomatically, trying to provide Brad with an explanation for his confusion, while avoiding direct criticism that would create additional complications. What became clear during these preparation sessions was that the project couldn't succeed with Brad as the primary presenter. He lacked the fundamental understanding of both the strategic methodology and Cascade's business context that would be necessary to deliver a credible consultation. Yet David remained committed to maintaining the fiction that Brad was the strategic leader, even as the evidence of his limitations became increasingly obvious. The client meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I knew that it would either expose the deception that had been driving the project or require me to find a way to ensure its success, despite the structural problems that David refused to acknowledge. As I prepared for what I knew would be a pivotal moment in my career, I realized that the situation had evolved beyond questions of recognition or advancement. The success of our most important client relationship was now dependent on resolving the disconnect between who was actually providing strategic value and who was being positioned to receive credit for that value. Jennifer Chen was expecting to receive sophisticated strategic recommendations from the person she believed had developed them. David Miller was expecting Brad to deliver a presentation that would validate his assessment of their respective capabilities. Brad was expecting to present strategic work he didn't understand to a client whose needs he had never directly addressed. Something fundamental would have to change, and I was the only person involved who understood all the variables that would determine whether the project succeeded or failed catastrophically. The conference room at Cascade Technologies felt unusually cold as I sat in the corner, laptop balanced on my knees, watching Brad Miller fumble through the opening slides of what was supposed to be the most important presentation of his career. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their downtown Portland headquarters illuminated the faces of Jennifer Chen and her executive team, their expressions shifting from polite attention to barely concealed confusion. As Brad struggled to explain strategic concepts he fundamentally didn't understand. "As you can see from our competitive analysis framework," Brad said, gesturing vaguely at a slide that displayed months of my research formatted into clear visual hierarchies, the market positioning opportunities for Cascade Technologies are substantial. The pause before substantial lasted long enough for everyone in the room to notice his uncertainty. Jennifer Chen, seated at the head of the polished oak conference table, leaned forward slightly, her expression suggesting she was waiting for more detailed explanation that wasn't coming. "Brad, can you walk us through the specific methodology you use to identify these positioning opportunities?" she asked, her tone professional but pointed. "I'm particularly interested in how you weighted the competitive factors in your analysis." I watched Brad's face flush slightly as he realized he couldn't answer the question. The competitive analysis methodology was something I'd developed over months of studying Cascade's market landscape, incorporating proprietary research techniques and analytical frameworks that I'd refined through direct conversations with Jennifer about their strategic challenges. Brad had read through my analysis, but had never understood the underlying methodology well enough to explain it to someone who had been expecting sophisticated strategic thinking. The weighting methodology is comprehensive, Brad replied, his confidence visibly faltering. Sarah, could you pull up the detailed breakdown of our analytical approach? The request to me was supposed to sound like a natural delegation to a research specialist, but Jennifer's expression suggested she found it odd that the lead strategist couldn't explain his own methodology. I opened my laptop and displayed the analytical framework I'd developed, knowing that I was about to face a choice between maintaining the deception and serving the client's actual needs. The competitive analysis incorporates 15 weighted factors across 4 strategic dimensions, I began, falling into the natural rhythm of explaining work I'd developed through careful research and analysis. Market share dynamics, technological differentiation, customer satisfaction metrics, and pricing strategy effectiveness. Each factor is weighted based on its correlation with revenue growth in the software solutions sector. As I continued explaining the methodology, I noticed Jennifer's posture changed subtly. She was listening with the kind of focused attention that indicated recognition, the same engaged interest she'd shown during our private strategic conversations over the past several months. Meanwhile, Brad stood beside the projection screen, nodding along to an explanation of work he couldn't have developed independently. Sarah, that analytical framework sounds very sophisticated, Jennifer said, her tone carrying implications that made me nervous. How long did it take your team to develop this methodology? The question was clearly directed at me, not Brad, despite his supposed role as project leader. I glanced at David Miller, who was sitting across the table with an expression of growing concern, apparently sensing that the client dynamic wasn't following the script he'd expected. The methodology evolved over several months of research and analysis, I replied carefully, trying to avoid taking direct credit while being honest about the development timeline. Several months, Jennifer repeated thoughtfully. And this research included the market segmentation analysis and competitive positioning framework that we discussed. When was our first conversation about this approach, Sarah? The trap was subtle but unmistakable. Jennifer was asking me to acknowledge our direct strategic conversations in front of David and Brad, essentially forcing me to choose between maintaining my employer's deception and providing honest answers to the client who had specifically requested this consultation based on my strategic input. We've discussed various strategic approaches during several project touchpoints, I said, hoping to provide a truthful but diplomatically vague response. Yes, our weekly strategic planning calls have been very productive, Jennifer said, her statement landing in the conference room like a revelation. Sarah's insights about market dynamics and competitive positioning have been invaluable for our strategic planning process. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through several color changes as he processed the implication that I had been having regular strategic conversations with his most important client without his knowledge or approval. Brad looked confused, apparently not understanding why the client was directing strategic questions to someone he'd been told was merely providing research support. Weekly strategic planning calls? David said slowly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that I recognized from previous confrontations. Sarah, I wasn't aware that you'd been having regular direct contact with Cascade's executive team. Jennifer? Chen's expression shifted to something approaching surprise, then concern, as she realized she had inadvertently exposed a relationship that was apparently supposed to be confidential. I hope I haven't created a problem, she said carefully. Sarah and I have been having weekly strategic conversations for the past 4 months. I assumed this was part of the standard account management process. The revelation that I'd been providing strategic consulting directly to their most valuable client for 4 months, completely outside of official agency protocols, created exactly the kind of crisis I'd been trying to avoid. David's expression suggested he was processing not just the unauthorized client contact, but the implications for everything he thought he knew about the Cascade account relationship. "Sarah, perhaps we should discuss this privately," David said, his tone controlled but clearly furious. "Actually," Jennifer interjected before I could respond, "I'd like to understand the account management structure before we continue with this presentation." Sarah has been providing strategic insights that directly informed our request for this consultation. If she's not the primary strategist on this project, I'm concerned about continuity in our strategic planning process. Her intervention was both protective and clarifying. Jennifer Chen was making it clear that her relationship was with me, not with Miller and Associates as an agency, and that the value proposition for their consulting engagement depended on my direct involvement rather than the hierarchical structure David had created. "Jennifer, let me clarify the project structure," David said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Brad is our senior strategist leading this engagement, with Sarah providing specialized research and analysis support. The strategic recommendations you'll receive represent our agency's collective expertise." "I see," Jennifer replied, her tone suggesting she didn't see at all. "Brad, can you explain how the strategic framework Sarah just described integrates with your overall recommendations for our market positioning?" It was a perfectly reasonable question that exposed the fundamental problem with the project structure. Brad couldn't explain the integration because he didn't understand the strategic framework well enough to build recommendations around it. He had been expecting to present my analysis as his own work, but he lacked the deep understanding necessary to field detailed questions about strategic methodology and implementation. "The integration strategy is multi-layered," Brad began uncertainly, "involving comprehensive market dynamics and positioning optimization." His response was so vague as to be meaningless, and everyone in the room recognized it. Jennifer's expression shifted from confusion to disappointment as she realized that the person designated as lead strategist couldn't provide substantive answers about strategic work she'd been expecting. "I think there might be some miscommunication about project roles and responsibilities," she said diplomatically. "Based on my conversations with Sarah over the past several months, I was expecting to work directly with the person who developed the strategic insights that led to this consultation." Request. Her statement created an impossible situation for David. He couldn't acknowledge that I had been providing senior-level strategic consulting without his knowledge, because that would undermine his credibility as account manager and raise questions about his oversight of the client relationship. But he also couldn't deny Jennifer's characterization without contradicting the client's direct experience. "Perhaps we should reschedule this presentation to ensure proper preparation," David suggested, clearly hoping to extract himself from a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. "Actually, I'd prefer to continue with Sarah presenting the strategic analysis," Jennifer said firmly. "Since she developed the methodology and understands our business context, it makes sense for her to walk us through the recommendations directly." The request was reasonable from a client service perspective, but it completely undermined the project structure that David had insisted on maintaining. If I presented the strategic analysis directly, it would be obvious to everyone that I was the actual strategist behind the work, not Brad. But refusing the client's request would likely damage the relationship with our most important account. "Sarah, why don't you present the strategic recommendations?" David said finally, his tone suggesting this was a magnanimous accommodation rather than an acknowledgement of reality. I moved to the front of the conference room and began presenting work that I'd developed through months of direct consultation with Cascade's leadership team. The strategic analysis flowed naturally because I understood every element of the methodology and could explain the reasoning behind each recommendation. I fielded detailed questions about market dynamics, competitive positioning, and implementation strategies with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about these challenges for months. As the presentation progressed, the contrast between My strategic understanding and Brad's earlier confusion became increasingly obvious. Jennifer and her team engaged with the recommendations enthusiastically, asking sophisticated questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements that demonstrated their recognition of the analysis quality. Sarah, this strategic framework addresses exactly the positioning challenges we've been discussing, Jennifer said as I concluded the presentation. The market segmentation approach and competitive differentiation strategy align perfectly with our growth objectives. Her endorsement was professional validation I'd been seeking for 2 years, but it came in a context that was professionally dangerous. David's expression suggested he was already planning how to address my unauthorized client relationship, while Brad looked confused about his role in a project where his supposed expertise had been clearly superseded. I'm glad the analysis meets your strategic planning needs, I replied, trying to maintain professional focus despite the personal satisfaction of finally receiving appropriate recognition for my work. After the client meeting concluded with enthusiastic approval of the strategic recommendations and a request for detailed implementation planning, David insisted on an immediate private conversation in an empty conference room down the hall from Cascade's offices. Sarah, what exactly has been happening with this client relationship? He demanded, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. 4 months of weekly strategic calls? Direct consultation on business strategy? This is completely outside of acceptable agency protocols. I had been preparing for this confrontation for months, knowing that my direct relationship with Jennifer would eventually be discovered. Jennifer Chen was asking strategic questions that required detailed follow-up, I explained. I was providing client service to ensure her needs were met. Client service, David repeated skeptically. Or were you deliberately building a relationship outside of proper account management channels? The accusation was both unfair and accurate. I had been building a direct consulting relationship with Cascade's leadership, but it had developed organically from their need for strategic expertise that wasn't being provided through official channels. Jennifer had initiated most of our conversations, seeking insights that she wasn't receiving from the presentations that Brad delivered. I was responding to client requests for strategic analysis, I said. Jennifer Chen specifically sought my input on marketing challenges that required detailed research and planning. Strategic analysis that should have been coordinated through proper account management, David replied. You've been operating as an unauthorized consultant while being paid as a research assistant. This is grounds for immediate termination. His threat was legally valid, but professionally hypocritical. Miller and Associates had been billing Cascade for senior-level strategic consulting, while having me provide the actual consulting services as unpaid overtime. David's anger wasn't really about protocol violations, it was about losing control over a client relationship that he'd been mismanaging through his insistence on keeping me invisible. David, Cascade Technologies specifically requested this. Consultation based on strategic work they'd been receiving, I said. Terminating the person who developed that work would probably damage the client relationship more than my protocol violations. It was a calculated risk to point out his dependence on my work, but the morning's presentation had made it clear that Brad couldn't provide the strategic expertise that Cascade was paying for. David was trapped between his anger about my unauthorized consulting and his need to maintain the client relationship that depended on my strategic contributions. We'll discuss your employment status after we complete this project, he said finally. But going forward, all client communication will be coordinated through appropriate channels. The compromise was temporary, but it gave me time to consider my options. I could return to the invisible support role that had defined my employment for 2 years, continuing to provide strategic value while accepting minimal recognition and compensation. Or I could use the client relationship I'd built to transition into independent consulting, providing the same strategic services directly, rather than through an intermediary who didn't value my contributions. That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Willamette River, reviewing the business plan I'd been developing for an independent marketing consultancy. The financial projections were encouraging. I could provide the same strategic services that Miller & Associates was delivering to Cascade, but at 40% of their billing rate while earning significantly more than my current salary. The emotional decision was more complex. Leaving Miller & Associates would mean abandoning the security of employment for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. But staying would mean continuing to enable a system that systematically undervalued my contributions while preventing me from advancing professionally. My phone rang around 9 o'clock, displaying Jennifer Chen's number. I answered, wondering if she was calling to discuss the morning's presentation or the obvious tension that had emerged during the client meeting. "Sarah, I wanted to follow up on this morning's presentation," she said. "The strategic recommendations were excellent, but I'm concerned about the account management situation. It seems like there might be some internal confusion about project roles." Her diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise her recognition that the agency's internal dynamics were affecting the quality of client service. "There have been some organizational changes in how we structure client teams," I replied carefully. "I see," Jennifer said. "Well, I want to be direct about something. The strategic value we've been receiving has come from your analysis and insights, regardless of how the agency structures its internal responsibilities. If there are going to be changes in who we work with going forward, that could affect our decision about continuing this consulting relationship." Her statement was a clear signal that Cascade's satisfaction with Miller & Associates depended on my continued involvement in their account. It was also an opening for a conversation about alternative arrangements that could serve their strategic needs more effectively. "Jennifer, can I ask you a hypothetical question?" I said, deciding to test the possibility that had been forming in my mind. "If you could work directly with the person providing strategic analysis, bypassing agency overhead and bureaucracy, would that be interesting from a cost and efficiency perspective?" The silence on the other end of the call lasted long enough for me to worry that I'd crossed a line by suggesting direct consulting. When Jennifer finally responded, her tone was thoughtful rather than alarmed. "That's an interesting question," she said slowly. "Our primary concern is receiving high-quality strategic analysis that addresses our business challenges effectively. The specific structure for accessing that expertise is secondary to the quality of insights and recommendations." Her response was encouraging but non-committal. She was indicating openness to alternative arrangements without making specific commitments that could complicate her relationship with Miller & Associates. "I appreciate that perspective," I said. "I'll continue providing the best strategic analysis possible, regardless of organizational structure." After ending the call, I spent the next several hours updating my business plan and researching the legal requirements for establishing an independent consulting practice. By morning, I had developed a comprehensive proposal for providing strategic marketing services directly to Cascade Technologies, along with a timeline for transitioning away from Miller & Associates. The decision had crystallized during my conversation with Jennifer. I could continue fighting for recognition within a system designed to exploit my contributions, or I could build something new that aligned my interests with my capabilities. The choice was between accepting David's assessment of my limitations or proving my value in the marketplace. 3 days later, I submitted my resignation letter to David Miller, effective in 2 weeks. The letter was professional and brief, thanking him for the opportunity to work at Miller & Associates while citing career advancement opportunities as my reason for leaving. David's reaction was predictably angry. "Sarah, this is extremely poor timing," he said during the exit interview he'd demanded. "We're in the middle of a major client engagement, and your departure could disrupt the project timeline." His concern about project disruption was ironic, given his insistence that I was merely providing research support. If my contributions were truly administrative, my departure shouldn't affect the strategic consulting that Brad was supposedly leading. "I've documented all the research methodologies and analytical frameworks for the Cascade project," I replied. "The transition should be manageable with proper planning." What I didn't mention was that I'd already had preliminary conversations with Jennifer Chen about providing strategic consulting services directly to Cascade Technologies. She had expressed strong interest in continuing our strategic planning relationship through an independent consulting arrangement that would provide them with more direct access to strategic expertise at a lower total cost. Sarah, I hope you understand that your resignation from this project could affect your professional reputation, David said, his tone carrying an implicit threat. Cascade Technologies is a major account, and disrupting their strategic consulting could impact your credibility in the Portland marketing community. His warning was meant to intimidate me into reconsidering my resignation, but it revealed his continued misunderstanding of my relationship with the client. Cascade's satisfaction with their strategic consulting depended on my continued involvement, not on Miller & Associates as an intermediary. I'm confident that Cascade will continue, receiving excellent strategic support, I said diplomatically. 2 weeks later, on my last day at Miller & Associates, I cleaned out my desk while Brad Miller struggled through a client presentation that I had prepared, but he couldn't adequately explain. David was scrambling to find replacement strategic talent who could maintain the quality of analysis that Cascade had been receiving, apparently discovering that my contributions had been more significant than he'd acknowledged. That afternoon, I signed a consulting agreement with Cascade Technologies to provide strategic marketing services at an annual rate that exceeded my previous salary by 200%. Jennifer Chen had decided that working directly with SAO, the source of strategic expertise, was more efficient than paying agency overhead for intermediary services that added minimal value. The irony wasn't lost on me that David Miller had spent 2 years insisting I wasn't ready for senior-level client relationships, while Jennifer Chen was so confident in my strategic capabilities that she was willing to restructure her company's marketing consulting arrangements to work with me directly. 6 months later, Sarah Johnson Consulting had grown to include 8 clients, including 3 Fortune 500 companies that had followed referrals from Jennifer Chen. My annual revenue exceeded what Miller & Associates had been paying me in 4 years, while my work schedule had become more manageable because I was compensated appropriately for strategic consulting rather than providing it as unpaid overtime. The most satisfying aspect of independent consulting wasn't the financial improvement, but the professional recognition. Clients valued my strategic insights and implemented my recommendations because they could see direct connections between my analysis and their business results. I was building authentic relationships based on delivering measurable value rather than navigating organizational politics that kept talented people invisible. David Miller had called twice requesting meetings to discuss partnership opportunities, apparently recognizing too late that losing my strategic capabilities had damaged his agency's ability to serve major clients effectively. I had declined both meetings, too busy building something meaningful to return to a system that had systematically undervalued my contributions. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't proving someone wrong through confrontation. It's proving yourself right by building something better and taking your value with you when you leave. The 2 years of unpaid overtime hadn't been exploitation after all. They had been an investment in developing the expertise and client relationships that would define my career on my own terms. As I reviewed quarterly performance reports for my consulting clients, I felt grateful for every unrecognized hour that had taught me my actual worth. David Miller had thought he was extracting free labor from someone who lacked strategic capabilities. Instead, he had been training the competition while teaching me exactly what kind of leader I never wanted to become. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of my downtown Portland office as I reviewed the quarterly performance reports spread across my mahogany desk. 18 months had passed since I'd walked away from Miller & Associates, and the numbers told a story that even I found difficult to believe. Sarah Johnson Consulting had grown from a single client to 15 major accounts, with annual revenue approaching 7 figures. The woman who had once been dismissed as purely administrative was now running one of the fastest-growing marketing consultancies in the Pacific Northwest. My assistant, Maya Rodriguez, knocked softly on my office door before entering with a steaming cup of coffee and a knowing smile. "The Portland Business Journal called again," she said, setting the coffee on my desk. "They want to feature you in their Entrepreneurs Under 30s You cover story. Something about disrupting traditional agency models." I laughed, remembering the performance review that had started this journey, the one where David Miller had questioned my initiative and leadership potential. "Schedule it for next week," I said. "But make sure they understand that this isn't a story about disruption. It's about recognizing value that was always there." Maya nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and there's someone here to see you. Says it's regarding a partnership opportunity. A David Miller from Miller & Associates." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. David Miller, the man who had systematically undervalued my contributions while taking credit for my strategic work, was sitting in my reception area hoping to discuss a partnership with the consultancy I'd built using the clients and expertise he'd dismissed. "Give me 5 minutes, then show him in," I said, needing a moment to process the emotional complexity of seeing someone who had shaped my career in ways he probably still didn't understand. During those 5 minutes, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The transition from employee to entrepreneur hadn't been without challenges. The first few months of independent consulting had required working longer hours than ever before, building systems and processes while simultaneously serving clients who expected the same level of strategic expertise I'd provided at the agency. But the work had been energizing rather than draining because every hour invested was building something I owned rather than subsidizing someone else's success. The early success with Cascade Technologies had created a foundation for growth that exceeded my most optimistic projections. Jennifer Chen had become not just a client, but a mentor and advocate, referring other executives who needed strategic marketing expertise. Within 6 months, I had enough steady business to hire my first employee. Within a year, I was turning down potential clients because demand exceeded my capacity to serve them effectively. What distinguished my consultancy from traditional agencies wasn't just the direct access to strategic expertise, but the collaborative approach I'd developed from years of being excluded from client relationships. Instead of presenting recommendations as finished products, I worked with clients to develop strategies together, ensuring they understood the reasoning behind each decision and could adapt the frameworks to changing business conditions. David entered my office looking older and more uncertain than I remembered. The confident demeanor that had once intimidated me was replaced by something approaching humility, though whether genuine or strategic remained to be seen. "Sarah, thank you for seeing me," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Your office is impressive. Congratulations on building something significant here." His compliment felt awkward given our history, but I appreciated the acknowledgement. "Thank you, David. Maya mentioned you wanted to discuss a partnership opportunity." He shifted uncomfortably, apparently struggling with how to approach a conversation that required acknowledging things he'd previously refused to recognize. "The marketing landscape has changed significantly over the past year," he began carefully. "Clients are increasingly looking for specialized strategic expertise rather than full-service agency relationships." I nodded, understanding where this was heading but curious to hear how he would frame it. That's been my experience as well. Companies want direct access to senior-level thinking without paying for organizational overhead. "Exactly," David said, his enthusiasm building as he found his pitch rhythm, "which is why I think there could be value in combining your strategic capabilities with Miller & Associates' established infrastructure. We could offer clients the best of both worlds, sophisticated strategic thinking and comprehensive execution capabilities." The proposal was professionally reasonable but personally complicated. David was essentially asking me to return to a relationship where my strategic expertise would be integrated with his agency operations, though presumably with more recognition and compensation than I'd received as an employee. What kind of partnership structure were you thinking about? I asked, genuinely curious about how he envisioned addressing the fundamental issues that had led to my departure. We could establish Sarah Johnson Consulting as a strategic partner for our major accounts, he explained. You'd maintain your independence while having access to our creative team, media planning capabilities, and account management infrastructure. We'd share revenue based on the value each organization brings to client relationships. It was a thoughtful proposal that demonstrated his recognition of my strategic capabilities, something he'd been unwilling to acknowledge when I was his employee. But it also revealed that he still didn't understand the core issue that had driven my decision to leave Miller & Associates. "David, can I ask you something directly?" I said, leaning forward slightly. "What changed your assessment of my strategic capabilities? 2 years ago, you told me I lacked the initiative and client management skills necessary for account leadership. Now you're proposing a partnership based on those same capabilities." The question forced him to confront the contradiction between his previous dismissal of my abilities and his current recognition of my value. He was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering how honest to be about his past misjudgments. "I think I underestimated your potential when you were working at the agency," he said finally. "The transition to independent consulting has clearly allowed you to develop leadership skills that weren't as visible in a larger organizational structure." His explanation was diplomatically phrased, but fundamentally inaccurate. My strategic capabilities hadn't developed after leaving Miller & Associates. They had been demonstrated consistently for 2 years while he refused to acknowledge them. The difference wasn't my professional growth, but his willingness to recognize abilities that had always been present. "I appreciate that perspective," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure the issue was organizational structure. The strategic work that attracted your partnership interest is the same work I was doing as your employee. The client relationships that convinced you of my capabilities are relationships I built while working at your agency." David's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that his revisionist narrative about my professional development wasn't entirely convincing. "Perhaps I should have recognized your contributions more clearly when you were part of our team," he acknowledged. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to receive, and I appreciated the admission even if it came 18 months too late. "I'm glad you can see that now," I replied. "But it raises questions about whether the fundamental dynamics that led to my departure have actually changed." "What do you mean?" he asked, though his tone suggested he suspected where this conversation was heading. "David, the partnership you're proposing would recreate many of the same structural issues that made our previous working relationship unsustainable," I explained. "I'd be providing strategic expertise while you maintained control over client relationships and revenue distribution. The power imbalance that prevented my advancement at Miller & Associates would still exist, just with different financial arrangements." He was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of my analysis. When he finally responded, his tone was more subdued than when he'd entered the office. "I hadn't considered it from that perspective," he said. "I was thinking about operational synergies rather than the interpersonal dynamics that led to your departure." His acknowledgement was significant because it represented the first time he'd recognized that my departure hadn't been about seeking better opportunities elsewhere, but about escaping a system that systematically undervalued my contributions. "The truth is, David, I've built something here that gives me direct control over my professional development and client relationships," I continued. "The independence has allowed me to serve clients more effectively while building a sustainable business model that aligns my interests with my capabilities." "I understand," he said, though his disappointed expression suggested he'd been hoping for a different response. "But Sarah, I want you to know that losing your strategic expertise was a significant loss for our agency. The Cascade account never recovered after your departure, and we've struggled to replace the quality of analysis you were providing." His admission was validating, but also somewhat tragic. David Miller had built his agency around the illusion that senior-level strategic consulting could be provided by junior-level staff working under his direction. When that illusion was exposed, he'd lost not just an employee, but the foundation for his most important client relationships. "What happened with Cascade?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Miller and Associates had managed the transition after my departure. David's expression darkened slightly. "Jennifer Chen terminated their consulting agreement 3 months after you left. She said the quality of strategic analysis had declined significantly and that she no longer felt confident in our ability to address their business challenges effectively." The outcome wasn't surprising, given Brad's limited strategic capabilities and David's unfamiliarity with the detailed analytical work that Cascade had been receiving. But it was a stark reminder of how much value had been flowing through my unauthorized consulting relationship, value that David had never fully recognized until it disappeared. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it sincerely. Despite our professional conflicts, I didn't take pleasure in seeing Miller and Associates struggle. "Have you been able to develop other senior-level strategic talent?" "We've hired several experienced strategists," he replied, "but client retention has been challenging. I think we developed a reputation for over-promising strategic capabilities that we couldn't consistently deliver." His candid assessment revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated during my time at the agency. Miller and Associates' business model had been built around my invisible contributions, with David taking credit for strategic work he couldn't replicate independently. When I left, the foundation for their premium positioning had disappeared, leaving them unable to justify the rates they'd been charging for senior-level consulting. "David, can I offer some advice?" I said, shifting into the consulting mode that had become natural for me. "Instead of trying to recreate what you had before, consider focusing on what you do best. Miller and Associates has excellent creative capabilities and project management systems. There's substantial value in those core competencies without trying to position the agency as a strategic consultancy." He listened thoughtfully to my recommendation, apparently recognizing that it was professional advice rather than personal criticism. "You're suggesting we focus on execution rather than strategy development?" "I'm suggesting you focus on your authentic strengths rather than trying to provide services that require capabilities you don't have," I clarified. "There's a significant market for agencies that can execute sophisticated campaigns developed by independent strategists. Partnership with consultants like me could give your clients access to strategic thinking while allowing you to focus on creative and operational excellence." The conversation was taking an interesting turn. Instead of discussing a partnership where I would provide strategic services under Miller and Associates brand, we were exploring a model where independent consultants could collaborate with the agency on specific projects while maintaining separate client relationships and business identities. "That's an intriguing approach," David said, his interest clearly genuine. "How would such collaborations work in practice?" I explained the collaborative model I'd been developing with other Portland area agencies, where independent consultants provided strategic planning services while partnering with specialized firms for creative development, media planning, and campaign execution. It was a network approach that allowed each organization to focus on their core competencies while providing clients with access to comprehensive marketing capabilities. "The key is transparency about roles and capabilities," I emphasized. "Clients understand exactly who is providing strategic analysis, who is developing creative concepts, and who is managing campaign execution. There's no confusion about organizational hierarchy or credit for specific contributions." David nodded slowly, apparently recognizing how different this model was from the structure that had created problems during my employment. "And revenue. Sharing is based on actual value contributed rather than organizational seniority?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "Each collaborator is compensated based on the specific expertise they provide. not their position within someone else's organizational chart. By the end of our conversation, we had outlined a framework for project-based collaboration that could serve mutual business interests while avoiding the structural issues that had made our previous working relationship unsustainable. David would focus Miller and Associates on creative and operational services, while I would provide strategic consulting for clients who needed both capabilities. Sarah, I want to apologize for not recognizing your contributions when you were part of our team, David said as our meeting concluded. I understand now that my assessment of your capabilities was limited by assumptions that prevented me from seeing your actual potential. His apology was more meaningful than I'd expected, partly because it acknowledged specific mistakes rather than offering vague regrets about how things had worked out. I appreciate that, David, and I want you to know that the experience at Miller and Associates, despite its challenges, taught me valuable lessons about what I wanted to build in my own practice. Such as, he asked, apparently curious about how his mismanagement had influenced my approach to running a consultancy. Transparency. About contributions, fair compensation for expertise, and direct relationships between consultants and clients, I replied. The things that were missing from my experience as your employee became the foundation for how I structure my business relationships. After David left, I spent the afternoon reviewing proposals from potential new clients, each representing opportunities to provide strategic marketing expertise to companies that valued independent thinking and direct collaboration. The contrast with my previous employment was striking. Instead of fighting for recognition within an organizational hierarchy that minimized my contributions, I was building relationships based on delivering measurable value to clients who appreciated sophisticated strategic analysis. My phone rang around 5 o'clock, displaying Jennifer Chen's number. She called monthly to discuss strategic initiatives at Cascade Technologies, maintaining the collaborative relationship that had started during my unauthorized consulting while I was still employed at Miller and Associates. Sarah, I have interesting news, she said after our usual exchange of pleasantries. I just had a conversation with Patricia Wong from Innovate Marketing. She mentioned that you'd been collaborating with them on the TechBridge account. Their CEO was extremely impressed with your strategic framework for their product launch. Jennifer's call reminded me of how much my professional network had expanded since starting independent consulting. Instead of being isolated within a single agency, I was building relationships across the Portland marketing community, collaborating with different specialists depending on client needs and project requirements. Patricia's team is excellent at campaign execution, I replied. The collaboration allowed TechBridge to benefit from both strategic planning and creative implementation without the overhead of a traditional agency relationship. That's exactly why I'm calling, Jennifer said. Cascade is considering a major rebranding initiative for our enterprise software division. It's complex enough to require both strategic consulting and full-service creative development. Would you be interested in leading the strategic component while partnering with an agency for creative and production work? Her proposal represented exactly the kind of sophisticated project that had driven my decision to pursue independent consulting. A multi-million-dollar rebranding initiative that would require the strategic expertise I'd developed over years of analyzing technology markets, combined with creative and production capabilities that I could access through collaborative partnerships. I'd be very interested in discussing that project, I said. Do you have thoughts about which agency you'd prefer to work with for the creative components? Actually, Jennifer said with a slight laugh, I was wondering if you might recommend someone. Your network of creative collaborators has consistently impressed me with the quality of their work. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering project scope, timeline, and collaborative structure. By the end of the call, we had outlined a rebranding initiative worth over $800,000, with me providing strategic consulting while partnering with carefully selected creative specialists for brand development and campaign execution. After hanging up, I realized that this single project would generate more revenue than I had earned in 2 full years as a Miller & Associates employee. But more importantly, It represented the kind of sophisticated strategic work that I'd been hoping to pursue when I first entered the marketing industry, before discovering how organizational hierarchies could limit professional development. That evening, I met my former colleague Maria Santos for dinner at a trendy restaurant in the Pearl District. Maria had left Miller & Associates 6 months after my departure, frustrated by the same organizational dynamics that had limited my advancement. She was now working as a financial consultant for small businesses, helping entrepreneurs develop sustainable business models. "Sarah, I've been following your success through the industry publications," she said over appetizers. "The Portland Business Journal article about your client growth was impressive. You've built something significant." I appreciated her recognition, particularly because Maria understood the context from which I'd emerged. "The transition has been more successful than I expected," I admitted. "But the real satisfaction comes from doing work that aligns with my capabilities rather than fighting organizational constraints." "Do you ever regret leaving the security of agency employment?" she asked, a question I'd been asked frequently by other marketing professionals, considering similar transitions. "The security was largely an illusion," I replied. "I was working 60-hour weeks for below-market compensation, while someone else took credit for my strategic contributions. The risk of independent consulting turned out to be much lower than the risk of remaining in a system that systematically undervalued my expertise." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "I've had similar experiences in corporate environments. The supposed security of employment often masks the risk of professional stagnation and undercompensation." Our conversation turned to the broader changes happening in the marketing industry, where traditional agency models were being challenged by independent consultants and specialized service providers who could deliver higher quality expertise at lower total costs. The hierarchical structures that had once dominated the industry were giving way to network-based collaborations that prioritized competence over organizational seniority. "What advice would you give to someone considering a similar transition?" Maria asked as we finished dinner. "Start building direct relationships with people who can evaluate your work independently," I said. "The biggest barrier to leaving traditional employment is the fear that your contributions aren't valuable enough to support independent consulting. But if you can demonstrate value to clients who are willing to pay for your expertise directly, the transition becomes much less risky." "And document everything," I added, remembering how essential my portfolio of strategic work had been for establishing credibility with potential clients. Most people underestimate their own capabilities because they've never had to articulate the value they provide in concrete terms. As I drove home through the quiet streets of downtown Portland, I reflected on how much had changed since that devastating performance review 18 months earlier. The woman who had been dismissed as lacking initiative and leadership potential was now running a consultancy that collaborated with Fortune 500 companies on strategic initiatives worth millions of dollars. But the most meaningful change wasn't financial or professional. It was the restoration of confidence in my own judgment and capabilities, confidence that had been systematically undermined by an employment structure that prioritized organizational hierarchy over individual competence. I had rediscovered the excitement of doing challenging work that made a meaningful difference for clients who valued sophisticated strategic thinking. The next morning brought an email that perfectly captured how much my professional life had transformed. It was from Rebecca Kim, a senior marketing executive at a major technology company, requesting strategic consulting for a market expansion initiative into international markets. "Sarah, your reputation for analytical rigor and innovative strategic frameworks has reached our executive team through several professional referrals," the email began. "We're hoping to engage your consulting services for a project that will determine our company's global growth strategy for the next 5 years." Reading that message, I thought about David Miller's assessment that I lacked the strategic thinking capabilities necessary for senior-level client relationships. A Fortune 500 company was requesting my strategic expertise for their most important business development initiative, recognizing analytical capabilities that my former employer had been unable to see. I responded to Rebecca's email with enthusiasm, knowing that this project would further establish my reputation as a strategic consultant who could address complex business challenges for major corporations. Each successful engagement built credibility. That led to more sophisticated opportunities, creating a virtuous cycle that was the opposite of the limiting dynamic I'd experienced as an undervalued employee. 6 months later, Sarah Johnson Consulting occupied a full floor of a renovated warehouse building in Portland's creative district, with a team of 12 specialists providing strategic marketing services to clients across North America. The business had grown beyond my initial projections, but more importantly, it had proven that recognizing and rewarding talent based on actual contributions rather than organizational politics could create sustainable competitive advantages. During our first annual company retreat, I addressed my team in the same conference room where I'd once sat as an invisible contributor to someone else's success. The foundation of this consultancy is the principle that every person's expertise should be recognized and compensated appropriately, I told the group. We succeed by ensuring that clients receive the best strategic thinking available, delivered by consultants who are valued for their actual contributions. It was a simple philosophy that represented everything I'd learned from 2 years of systematic undervaluation, followed by 18 months of building something better. The most powerful response to being dismissed isn't proving someone wrong through confrontation. It's proving yourself right by creating value that speaks for itself. As I looked around the room at consultants who had joined the practice specifically because they wanted to work in an environment that prioritized competence over hierarchy, I felt grateful for every overlooked contribution that had taught me what I never wanted to replicate. David Miller had thought he was extracting free strategic consulting from someone who lacked leadership potential. Instead, he had been training someone who would build a more effective alternative to everything he represented. The woman who had once been called purely administrative was now leading strategic consulting engagements for clients who valued expertise over organizational politics, building a business that proved talent could flourish when properly recognized and supported. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.